ever make a decision and think, wait, why did I do that?
Mm.
That's what we're diving into today, those moments where you question every choice you've ever made. We've got research on cognitive biases, social influence, all that good stuff. Like, are we really in control of our decisions, or are our brains working against us?
It's wild when you look at the early models of decision-making, like expected utility theory. They thought we were totally rational, always calculating the best outcome, like some kind of robot.
Right, like our brains are just little calculators weighing the pros and cons.
Yeah, but it turns out we're way more complex than that.
Which is good news for us.
Yeah.
Right? Gives us more to unpack in this deep dive. So let's talk about those curveballs our brains throw, the cognitive biases we see in the research.
Basically, think of them like mental shortcuts. Your brain's trying to be efficient, right? It wants to save energy because there's just too much information out there.
Makes sense.
The thing is, those shortcuts can lead to some pretty predictable errors.
Like taking the scenic route when you're already late.
Exactly.
Okay, so what kind of detours are we talking about?
Well, let's take the availability heuristic.
Okay.
Ever notice how, like, after you watch a shark attack movie, suddenly every shadow in the water freaks you out?
Wait, is that why I do that? I just thought I had an overactive imagination.
Maybe, maybe not. Could be your brain overestimating the likelihood of a shark attack. Because those images, they're so vivid and easy to recall.
Ah, okay.
It's the same reason people might be scared of flying after a plane crash is all over the news, even though driving is statistically way riskier.
So our brains are basically drama queens, going straight for the most dramatic scenario.
Pretty much.
And what about, like, when we only see what we want to see?
Oh, that's confirmation bias.
Yeah.
It's that tendency to seek out information that just confirms what we already believe.
Like, my social media feed is the worst for this. It's like an echo chamber.
Right. It's like that saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Or if all you read are articles that agree with you, every issue seems very straightforward.
Exactly. We create these echo chambers, maybe not on purpose, but they distort how we see things.
So it's not just what we think, it's how we think.
Right.
We've got these biases, sure. But how much is our thinking influenced by how information is presented? Like the actual wording, the way it's framed.
That's where framing effects come in. It's how the way information is presented, it can totally sway our choices, even if the underlying options are the same.
Interesting.
Like, people are more likely to choose a treatment that has a 70% survival rate.
Yeah.
Compared to one with a 30% mortality rate.
Yeah, I get that.
But they mean the exact same thing.
It's all about the spin. Like, I'm way more likely to buy a shirt if it says vintage inspired rather than secondhand.
Exactly.
But it's kind of scary how easily we can be swayed.
For sure, but you know what's interesting?
What?
This whole thing relates to behavioral economics. Researchers are figuring out how to use this stuff to actually help people make better choices.
Ooh, tell me more about that.
Well, one example is using what they call default options. Like, if you automatically enroll employees in a retirement savings plan, people are way more likely to just stick with it.
Oh, interesting.
Even though they could opt out if they wanted to. It's leveraging inertia, but in a good way.
It's like we're all part of this giant behavioral economics experiment. Okay, but all this talk about biases, it makes it sound like we're wired to make bad decisions. Is there any hope for us?
Oh, absolutely. Think of it like this. You wouldn't blame yourself for having a blind spot when you're driving, right?
Right.
But you definitely want to know about it.
Yeah.
So you could adjust your mirrors and be extra careful.
Okay.
Well, these biases are kind of like mental blind spots.
I like that.
We all have them. But by recognizing them, we can navigate around them.
So instead of beating ourselves up for not being perfectly rational robots, we could just be more self-aware when we're making decisions.
Exactly. And, that self-awareness, it goes beyond just our thinking.
What do you mean?
Our emotions play a huge role in our choices, too, even if we don't realize it.
So emotions, they can really mess things up sometimes, right?
Absolutely.
We like to think we're being all logical and level-headed, but we've all made those decisions where we're like, what was I thinking?
Yeah.
And it usually boils down to emotions, right?
Oh, totally. Think about, like, that last-minute vacation you booked because you were so burned out.
Oh, been there.
Or that time you just lost it and snapped at a coworker because you were stressed.
Ugh, yeah. Emotions can totally hijack our better judgment.
It happens to the best of us. And, a good mood can make you spend money like it's going out of style.
Oh, tell me about it. Like, sure, why not? I deserve this.
Exactly. But on the flip side, when we're stressed or anxious, our brains just don't function as well.
Wait, seriously? So all that stress baking I do, Is my brain betraying me?
In a way, yes. Stress really messes with the prefrontal cortex, and that's the part of our brain that's in charge of, like, rational thought, planning.
Okay, well, at least now I don't feel so bad about that entire batch of cookies I ate last week.
Mhm.
But it's not just our own emotions we're dealing with, is it? There's also that pressure to fit in, to make choices that other people will approve of.
Exactly. We can't talk about decision-making without talking about social influence.
It's a huge part of it.
Huge. Think about it. From the clothes we wear to the careers we choose, so much of what we do is shaped by what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, no one wants to be the first to eat the crab, right? We're always looking to others for cues like how to behave, what's acceptable, even what we should want.
Exactly. And this social influence, it can be crazy strong, especially when it comes from people we respect.
Oh, 100%. Like if my favorite influencer recommends a product, I am way more likely to buy it, even if I don't actually need it.
That's the power of authority figures, right?
It's true.
We just trust their judgment, sometimes without even realizing it. And then there's the phenomenon of information cascades.
Okay, that sounds a little intense. What's
Yeah.
an information cascade?
So basically, one person makes a decision. Doesn't even have to be a good decision, but then that influences the next person and the next and so on.
Oh, okay. It creates this snowball effect. Suddenly, everyone's following the crowd without really thinking for themselves.
So it's like how certain restaurants get trendy overnight. Everyone sees the long line and assumes the food must be amazing,
And
even if it's just average.
exactly. Or think about the stock market, right?
Mhm.
People buy a stock just because everyone else is, even if there's no real reason for the price to be going up.
Wow, so we're all just sheep following the herd. That's kind of depressing.
Well, not always. It's important to remember that social influence isn't always a bad thing.
Really?
Yeah, it can actually be a powerful force for good.
Okay, so how do we harness that power then? How do we use social influence for good instead of letting it lead us astray?
It all starts with awareness. Once we understand how social influence works, we can start to see when we're being swayed by the crowd.
Oh, okay, I see. And when we're making choices that line up with our own values.
So it's about finding that balance between fitting in and being true to ourselves. Like, yeah, I want to be part of the group, but I also don't want to lose myself in the process.
Exactly. And that's such an important point. Making good decisions isn't just about like logic and reason.
Right.
It's also about being in tune with our emotions, understanding what we value, and recognizing how much our social circles influence us.
Like trying to solve a puzzle, but we have to use all the pieces, not just the ones that seem obvious or easy.
I love that analogy. And just like solving a puzzle, becoming a better decision maker takes practice.
Practice makes perfect, right?
Well, not perfect,
Yeah.
but the more we work those decision-making muscles, the more we slow down, challenge our assumptions, get different perspectives, the more confident we become.
So it's a journey, not a destination. We're never going to be totally immune to biases or outside influence.
Exactly.
Okay. But all this talk about biases and social pressure makes you wonder, like, do we even have free will? Are we really in control of our choices? Or are we just products of our environments and experiences?
Oh, man. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Philosophers have been trying to figure that out for centuries.
Well, there goes my afternoon,
Yeah.
lost in an existential crisis.
Right.
But really, though, if all these external factors influence us, where does our own agency come in?
That's where things get really interesting because even though we can't control every little thing, like we can't eliminate all our biases now, we still have the power to choose how we respond.
Okay, I like that.
We can choose to pay attention to our thoughts and feelings. We can choose to look for information that challenges what we think we know.
So even if it feels like we're being pulled in a million different directions,
Yeah.
we can still steer the ship.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that we always have a choice, even when it doesn't feel like it.
That's actually very empowering. But sometimes, even when we know what we should do, it's still hard to actually do it.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where those practical strategies we were talking about are so important.
Right.
They're not just abstract ideas. They're tools that help us close that gap between what we know and what we actually do.
Because it's one thing to read about cognitive biases, another thing to catch ourselves in the act. Yeah.
Exactly.
Like, wait a minute, am I falling for confirmation bias right now?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to actually practice those strategies, like slowing down, challenging our assumptions. Those aren't things you do once and then you're done.
Right.
They're things we have to keep doing if we want to get better at this whole decision-making thing.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
We're never going to be perfect at it.
That's okay. Because the goal isn't to be perfect. It's to be more aware, more intentional.
And ultimately, more empowered to make choices that really matter to us.
I love that.
Me too.
Oh,
It's about embracing the journey, accepting that we're going to make mistakes along the way.
exactly.
But those mistakes, those are all opportunities to learn and grow.
Exactly. And, as we get more comfortable with that process, we might even start to see those so-called mistakes as valuable feedback.
Oh, I like that. Instead of beating ourselves up, we can ask, what did I learn from that experience?
Yes.
How can I use that to make a different choice next time?
Exactly. That's how we turn those failures into opportunities for growth.
I love that.
It's about shifting our perspective,
Yeah.
moving away from that fear of making the wrong choice.
And embracing the possibility of making better choices in the future.
Yes. Beautifully said.
It's about being kind to ourselves, and to other people who are also figuring things out as they go.
That compassion is so important because we're all in this together.
That's so true.
We're all just trying to make the best choices we can. And let's be real, sometimes we're going to get it wrong.
We're all human. Right.
Exactly. And that's okay. It's all part of the process.
But it helps to remember that we don't have to do it alone.
Absolutely. And that's where that social influence we were talking about, can actually source of support.
Oh, interesting.
Instead of just following the crowd blindly,
Yeah.
we can look for people who challenge us to think critically.
People who are open-minded and want to learn and grow.
Exactly.
It's about finding our people, right?
Yeah.
The ones who encourage us to be our best selves and who have our backs when we stumble.
Yes.
Because let's be real, we're all going to stumble at some point.
That's life, right? And when we stumble, that's when we need that support the most.
It's not just about making better decisions for ourselves, is it? It's also about creating a world where everyone feels supported and empowered. A world where we can all make choices that feel true to who we are.
Beautifully said. And I think that's a perfect transition into the next part of our conversation.
Okay, so we've covered how our own biases and even social pressure can influence our decisions.
Right.
But what about those bigger forces at play? The stuff that feels totally outside our control.
Right.
The research mentions something about environmental transformations impacting our decisions. What does that even mean?
Well, it's basically acknowledging that the world around us shapes our choices.
Okay.
Things like climate change, political polarization, these big shifts create a whole new playing field for decision making, right?
Okay, that makes sense. Suddenly we're not just thinking about what we saw anymore. We have to consider the potential impact on, the planet, on future generations.
Exactly.
It's a lot more to think about.
It is. Think about it, 10 years ago, did you ever think about the carbon footprint of your groceries?
Probably not.
Or how your vote in a local election might affect global warming?
Okay, I see what you mean. It's like choosing paper or plastic at the grocery store. It suddenly feels like a tiny piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Right, and it can feel overwhelming.
Totally overwhelming.
For sure, but that's where that feeling of agency, that control over our own choices becomes super important.
Because it's easy to feel powerless, right, when you're up against these huge global challenges.
Absolutely, but the truth is, every choice we make, even the small ones, they all contribute to the solution.
So it's about focusing on what we can control, even if it just feels like our own little corner of the world.
Exactly. It's like if everyone made a little effort to reduce their carbon footprint, those individual actions, they'd add up to a huge impact.
That's actually really encouraging to hear. So instead of getting overwhelmed by how big everything is, we can focus on the fact that we're not alone in this.
Right. And that's where those supportive communities we talked about earlier, they can really make a difference.
Because when we see other people who are also trying to make a difference.
Exactly. It creates the sense of collective momentum.
We feel supported, encouraged, and like we're actually part of something bigger than ourselves.
Yes.
It's like that saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We really do need each other, don't we?
We absolutely do.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. It's amazing to think that all these things are biases, social pressures, global issues.
Sure.
They all play a part in the choices we make every single day.
It's a lot to take in, for sure.
It really is.
And it's an ongoing process. It's not like we ever reach a point where we're like, okay, I've mastered decision making. Right. But that's okay, because it's all about learning and growing, right?
Yeah.
Always questioning and refining how we make choices. That's where the real magic happens.
So for our listeners who are just wrapping their heads around all of this, what's one key takeaway they can start using today?
That's a good question. I think if there's one thing I hope people remember from this PM, it's the power of the pause.
The power of the pause.
Yes. In a world that's constantly telling us to rush, to make quick decisions,
Yeah.
taking a moment to pause can make a world of difference.
It's like hitting the reset button on our brains,
Right.
right? We give ourselves a chance to breathe, to actually think things through
Exactly.
before we just jump into a decision.
Exactly. So next time you're facing a choice, big or small, take a moment to pause.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what's influencing me right now? What are my priorities? What really matters to me?
Because when we're aware of all those things, that's when we can start making choices that are truly aligned with who we are.
Beautifully said.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you to our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned some valuable insights about decision-making and that you feel empowered to make choices that are true to yourselves. Until next time, we'll see you out there.